70% of our audience believe the Thatcher death parties were in bad taste. These were the parties that were thrown around the funeral and around the news of Lady Thatcher's death. But Richard, Mrs. Thatcher thrived on controversy. I think she'd have quite liked the parties, don't you?
Well, you know, I think they were bad taste, but I think there are worse things than bad taste. And worse than bad taste, I'm sure Mrs. Thatcher would have thought the same, is to live in fantasy. And I thought at least what you got with the Thatcher parties was you saw someone living in a world which you found vaguely recognisable, which I didn't find at all with the funeral itself and with the kind of great solemnities to which everybody rose. This idea that somehow around Thatcher's death we would all meet and mourn solemnly the passing of a leader who somehow stood for something to which we can all subscribe and all wipe a tear as we say farewell to. That was a wicked, wicked, wicked lie. And it completely disenfranchised the people of England who'd been busy disenfranchising in her political career too. It was a fantasy, and I thought that was objectionable. And it's also... it's a fantasy, and also it's a funeral. And a funeral is where someone goes to meet their maker. It's a very simple sort of thing. And to turn it cynically into some great big political exercise is cynical and wrong. And I'll get my coat.
I choose to believe that people were not cheering in some horrible way about an old lady. They were trying to show disagreement with her political approach.
And that's right. And I do think there's this sense that, I mean, what concerned me about the funeral and everything, and the way it was sort of played out in the media, was that somehow it was a kind of national moment that we were all signed up to, and I think we weren't at all. And if you go north of Watford, if you go to the northeast of England, if you go to Scotland, where I was recently, the idea that somehow that represented something around which people could cohere is just completely nonsensical. And, you know, that's nothing to say about the personal qualities of the person. I think she was a fascinating person, hugely important person, but they got that wrong. It wasn't about her, it was about a sort of cynical political manipulation. And it was very Skyfall. That whole thing of Skyfall, of, you know, the Union Jack coming down.
Where were the Komodo dragons?
But they were not, she was the Komodo dragon. But, no, but... Sorry, I didn't mean that. But there was this thing about the Thatcher funeral which sort of bothered me. Like in Skyfall, there's this sense about being in love with your own death. And it's another aspect of fantasy. Skyfall, we lower the Union Jack, we look back on our imperial past, we wipe a tear from our eye, and we kind of get off on that. And I thought it was the same thing with Thatcher. I think the biggest row I ever had with the curate was over the death of Margaret Thatcher. It was exactly that point. I remember seeing communities of miners in South Wales being absolutely destroyed by her policies. The curate grew up 15 years younger than me with a completely different experience of her, thinking that she was sort of part of the national furniture in the way that the Queen was part of the national furniture or his gran was part of the national furniture. And when she died, it was like this moment of complete mutual incomprehension. I couldn't understand why he felt sad. He couldn't understand why I found it so difficult to feel sad. And it was a generational thing.